My name is Ruth Blackwood, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. Some nights, when I lay awake staring at my ceiling, I still can't believe we survived what happened in the Pine Barrens. It was supposed to be a simple summer vacation, just me, my husband Harold, our 3 kids, and our loyal German Shepherd Rex. Harold had been so excited when he bought that cream-colored 1960 Winnebago. "Think of the adventures we'll have," he'd said, his eyes twinkling like a kid on Christmas morning. If only we'd known what kind of adventure was waiting for us. Tommy, our oldest at 12, was going through that phase where he thought he was too cool for family trips. Lucy, our 9-year-old, couldn't stop talking about taking pictures with her new Kodak camera. And little Betty, just 6, clutched her favorite teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles, as we packed our bags that morning. "Are we there yet?" Betty asked for the 100th time as we drove through New Jersey. Harold laughed, adjusting his glasses in that way he always did when he was trying to be patient. "Not yet, Princess. We're heading to a special place called the Pine Barrens." I remember how the trees started getting thicker as we drove deeper into the Barrens. The road got narrower, and the radio started acting funny. Just static, and bits of old songs cutting in and out. Rex, usually so calm, kept whining and pressing his nose against the window. That's when we saw the little diner, sitting all alone on the side of the road like something out of an old movie. Harold thought it would be a good place to stop for lunch and ask for directions. The rusty bell above the door jingled as we walked in, and that's when everything started to feel wrong. The old man behind the counter looked at our kids, then at us, with eyes that seemed too sad for someone running a roadside diner. "Folks," he said, wiping his hands on a dirty apron, "you all planning on camping in the Barrens?" When Harold nodded, the man's face got real serious. "Word of advice," he said, leaning in close. "Stay on the marked paths. Whatever you hear at night, birds' voices, your own names being called, don't follow them, and keep your children close." I should have listened harder to that warning. I should have turned our Winnebago around right then and there. But how could I have known? How could any of us have known what was waiting for us in those dark ancient woods? What happened over the next 3 days would change our lives forever. Some of us wouldn't make it out at all, and those of us who did, well, we'd never be the same again. We found a campsite just before sunset. Harold said it looked perfect. A nice clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees. Tommy helped his dad park the Winnebago, while Lucy and Betty collected small sticks for the campfire. Rex seemed restless, pacing back and forth, and sniffing the air more than usual. That's when I noticed something odd. About 50 feet from our spot, there was another campsite. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. A blue tent was half collapsed, and camping chairs were knocked over. "Harold," I called out, "come look at this." We walked over together. A pot of beans sat on a portable stove, still warm. Paper plates with half-eaten hot dogs were scattered on a picnic table. Whoever had been here left everything behind, even their wallets and car keys. "Mommy," Betty's voice made me jump. She was holding something in her tiny hands. "Look what I found." It was a feather, about as long as my hand. At first it looked ordinary, grayish-brown with black spots. But there was something strange about it. When Betty turned it in her hands, it seemed to shimmer, like how a cat's eyes shine in the dark. "Can I keep it?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Before I could answer, Rex started barking. Not his usual friendly bark, but something different, almost scared. The sun was setting fast, and the trees around us suddenly seemed taller, darker. "Let's get back to our camp," Harold said quietly. "We should start dinner before it gets too dark." As we walked back, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a bird call, but not like any bird I'd ever heard before. It sounded almost human, like someone trying to copy a bird's voice but not quite getting it right. Tommy must have heard it too. "Mom," he whispered, walking closer to me, "I don't like this place." We tried to have a normal evening. Harold got the campfire going, and I made hot dogs and s'mores for the kids. But none of us could shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woods seemed too quiet, except for those strange bird calls that kept getting closer. Betty wouldn't let go of that feather. As night fell completely, I noticed something that made my heart stop beat. The feather was glowing, not bright, but with a soft greenish light, like a firefly. "Time for bed, everyone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tomorrow we'll explore properly." But as I tucked the kids into their beds in the Winnebago, I couldn't help but wonder about the abandoned campsite. What had made those people leave so suddenly? And why did I have this terrible feeling that we were about to find out that was just the beginning of our first night in the Pine Barrens? If I'd known what was coming next, I would have started the engine and driven away as fast as I could. But we stayed. God help us, we stayed. None of us could sleep that first night. The darkness felt heavy, like a thick blanket wrapping around our Winnebago. Every small sound made us jump. Rex wouldn't stop pacing, his nails clicking against the floor as he moved from window to window, growling softly. Around midnight, we heard it, the sound of something big moving above us. Thump, 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 like giant wings beating against the night air. Harold tried to tell us it was just a large owl, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Dad," Tommy suddenly whispered from his bunk. "There's something out there." We all rushed to his window. In the darkness between the trees, two red eyes glowed like hot coals. They were too high up to be a deer or a bear. Whatever it was taller than any animal I'd ever seen. The radio on our counter suddenly crackled to life by itself. Through the static, we heard children's voices singing an old hymn I remembered from my childhood. But the voices, they sounded wrong, like they were underwater or coming from very far away. "Turn it off," I whispered to Harold. But when he tried, the radio kept playing, even after he pulled out the batteries. Betty started crying softly, clutching her glowing feather. Lucy sat frozen in her bed, her face pale in the dim light. Rex backed into a corner, his ears flat against his head. Then we heard something that made my blood run cold. Someone calling my name from outside. "Ruth, come out and play." It sounded like a child's voice, but distorted like someone trying to remember how children speak. Harold grabbed my arm as I instinctively moved toward the door. "Don't," he said firmly. "Remember what the diner owner said. Whatever we hear, don't follow the voices." We huddled together in the middle of the Winnebago, listening to the wing beats above us, the strange singing from the radio, and those horrible voices calling our names one by one. The glowing feather in Betty's hand cast weird shadows on the walls. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sun started to rise. As the first light touched the trees, everything went quiet. The radio stopped playing, the wing beats disappeared, and those red eyes vanished. We thought the worst was over. We were wrong, so terribly wrong. Because when Lucy walked outside to use the bathroom that morning, she disappeared for 3 whole hours. And when she came back, that's when our real nightmare began. Looking back now, I realized that first night was just a warning, a small taste of the horror waiting for us in those ancient woods. If only we'd listened. If only we'd left right then. But we didn't, and now I have to live with those consequences forever. It happened so fast. One minute Lucy was walking to the bathroom area, we'd set up behind some trees, and the next minute she was just gone. I still remember the panic in my chest when I called her name and got no answer. "Lucy." Harold's voice boomed through the trees. "Lucy." We searched everywhere. Tommy ran between the trees calling for his sister while I held Betty, who wouldn't stop crying. Rex sniffed the ground, going in circles like he was confused. It was strange, even our skilled family dog couldn't pick up her scent. The morning sun couldn't cut through the thick pine trees, making everything look gray and misty. As we searched, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Huge claw marks on top of our Winnebago. They were fresh, deep scratches that had torn right through the metal roof. 3 hours passed like 3 years. We were about to call the park rangers when Lucy just walked out of the woods. She looked dazed, like someone who just woke up from a deep sleep. Her clothes were clean, too clean, like she hadn't been in the woods at all. "Lucy, baby, where were you?" I rushed to her, checking her for injuries. "I don't remember, Mom," she said, her voice flat. "I was walking to the bathroom and then nothing." She kept staring at something behind us, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. That's when Rex disappeared. We heard him bark once, a sharp, frightened sound, and then silence. Harold found his collar near the abandoned campsite. Just the collar, nothing else. Lucy sat in the Winnebago, drawing strange symbols in her notebook. They looked like the ones on Betty's glowing feather. When I asked her about them, she just smiled, not her usual happy smile, but something different, something that made me shiver. "The wings are getting stronger, Mom," she whispered, still drawing. "It's calling us, all of us." Tommy started acting strange too. He kept walking toward the woods until Harold or I pulled him back. His eyes looked glazed over, like he was in a trance. That afternoon, we tried to leave. Harold turned the key in the ignition, but the engine just made a horrible screeching noise, like something was wrapped around it. Something that didn't want us to go. As the sun started to set again, Betty tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy," she said, pointing to Lucy, "why does Sissy have red eyes when she blinks?" I looked at my middle child, and for a split second, I saw what Betty meant. When Lucy blinked, her eyes flashed red, just like those eyes we'd seen in the woods. That's when I realized we weren't just lost in the Pine Barrens. Something had found us. Something was changing my children. And as the second night began to fall, I knew we were running out of time to save them. Harold grabbed my hand and whispered, "Ruth, whatever happens tonight, we have to protect our kids. No matter what. If only we'd known then what no matter what would really mean." The second night was worse. Much worse. Betty started speaking in a strange language, words that no 6-year-old should know. Her eyes were wide open, and she kept stroking that glowing feather while rocking back and forth. "The Ancient One comes," she said, in a voice that wasn't her own. "It wants to make us like it. A family in the dark." Then we heard it, voices calling from outside. But these weren't just any voices. They were our voices. I heard myself calling Harold's name, and Harold heard me calling his. The thing out there, whatever it was, could copy how we sounded. "Daddy," it called in Betty's sweet voice. "Help me, Daddy. I'm scared." Harold gripped the baseball bat we'd brought for camping games, so hard his knuckles turned white. "Don't listen," he kept saying. "It's not them. It's not real." Tommy sat in the corner, his eyes completely black now. He started humming the same hymn we'd heard on the radio. Lucy sat next to him, drawing more and more of those strange symbols, her hands moving faster than seemed possible. That's when we saw it through the windows, a huge shadow moving between the trees. It was tall, taller than any person. It had wings but not like bird wings. These were leather-like, like a bat's wings, but enormous. Its head, I still have nightmares about that head. It looked almost like a horse's skull, but with horns and those burning red eyes. The Jersey Devil, the creature from all those local legends. It was real, and it was right outside our Winnebago. "Mom," Lucy whispered, still drawing, "it's beautiful, isn't it? Soon we'll all be beautiful too." I noticed dark patches appearing on Lucy's neck. They looked like scales. When she smiled, her teeth seemed sharper. She was changing, right in front of my eyes. The creature started circling our Winnebago, its claws scraping against the metal. Each scratch made a sound that hurt our ears. Betty's feather was glowing brighter now, and suddenly I noticed something. Whenever she held it up, the creature moved back, like it was afraid of the light. Harold saw it too. "The feather," he said quietly, "it's protecting us." But for how long? The night seemed to go on forever. We huddled together, watching Tommy fall deeper under the creature's spell, seeing Lucy's transformation continue, and listening to Betty speak in that ancient language. The Jersey Devil kept testing our defenses, looking for a way in. I found myself staring at Betty's drawings scattered on the floor. They weren't just random symbols, they formed patterns, circles within circles. They reminded me of the protective symbols I'd seen in old books about the Pine Barrens. As I looked closer at these drawings, I began to understand why the feather glowed and what we needed to do to survive. But the price for that knowledge would be higher than I could have ever imagined, because outside the Jersey Devil was getting impatient. And soon, very soon, it would make its final move to claim us all. Just before dawn, the Jersey Devil attacked. It smashed into the Winnebago with a force that rocked us like a toy. The windows cracked, and the door groaned under its weight. Harold stood in front of us, bat ready, but we all knew it wouldn't be enough. "The symbols," I shouted, grabbing Betty's drawings. "We need to use them." I started placing the papers with the circular patterns on the windows and doors. Each time I did, the creature howled, a sound between a scream and a roar that made my teeth hurt. Lucy was fully changing now, her skin turning scaly, her eyes glowing red like the devil's. She lunged at me, trying to tear down the drawings. "No, Mommy," she shrieked in a voice that wasn't hers anymore. "Let it in, we need to join it." Tommy was no better, his body twitching as he fought the devil's control. "The Ancient One must feed," he muttered. Harold held them back while I worked. Betty just sat in the corner, that feather glowing brighter than ever, still speaking that strange language. The Winnebago's roof suddenly peeled back like the lid of a tin can. The Jersey Devil's face appeared, all teeth and horns and those terrible red eyes. It reached for Betty with a clawed hand. "No," Harold yelled. He swung the bat, hitting the creature's arm. It screamed in pain and anger. For a moment, everything stopped. The devil pulled back, nursing its hurt limb. Lucy and Tommy collapsed, panting. In that brief quiet, I heard Betty's voice change. She wasn't speaking the strange language anymore. She was singing, the same hymn we'd heard on the radio. The feather in her hand blazed like a tiny sun. The Jersey Devil shrieked and backed away from the light. The feather, I realized. It's not just protecting us, it can drive it away. I grabbed the feather from Betty, and held it up. The creature retreated further, its red eyes dimming. But I could feel the feather getting hot in my hand, like it was using up its power. Harold saw what I was doing and understood. He looked at me, then at the kids, then back at me. I saw the decision in his eyes, before he said anything. "Take the kids and run," he said quietly. "I'll hold it off." "Harold, no," I started to say, but he cut me off with a kiss. "I love you," he said. Then he grabbed the feather from my hand, and charged at the devil. The last thing I saw before I grabbed the kids and ran, was Harold, my brave, wonderful Harold, pushing the blazing feather into the creature's face. The Jersey Devil's scream shook the entire forest. We ran and ran, the sounds of the fight fading behind us. Lucy and Tommy seemed to wake up as we got further away, confused and scared. Betty just kept singing softly. When we finally reached the road, I looked back. The forest was quiet. There was no sign of Harold, or the Jersey Devil. Just the rising sun painting the sky pink over the dark trees. We were safe. But we weren't all there, and deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because as I hugged my children close, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small patch of scales on Lucy's neck, slowly spreading under her shirt collar. The Jersey Devil might have lost this battle, but it wasn't done with us yet. Not by a long shot. It's been 3 months since that horrible night in the Pine Barrens. We live in a small apartment now, far from New Jersey. I tell people I'm a widow, and they give me sad smiles, never knowing the real truth about how I lost Harold. Tommy doesn't remember much of what happened. He gets headaches sometimes, and wakes up speaking that strange language, but it's getting better. Betty keeps drawing those symbols, but the new feather she found doesn't glow anymore. Maybe that's for the best. But Lucy is different. At first I thought the scales would fade. They didn't, they've spread across her back now, and sometimes at night, I hear scratching sounds from her room. Last week, I found claw marks on her windowsill, from the inside. She doesn't eat normal food anymore. Yesterday, I caught her in the backyard, eating a raw bird. When she looked up at me, her eyes were that terrible red color again. But worst of all was her smile, so much like the Jersey Devil's. "Don't worry, Mommy," she said, wiping blood from her mouth. "Soon you'll understand. It's still calling us. All of us. And one day, we'll go back." I've started putting Betty's protective symbols around Lucy's room. They seem to help a little. But every night, I hear wings beating outside our apartment window, even though we're on the 10th floor. Something is watching us, waiting. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear Harold's voice calling from the darkness. The Jersey Devil is still using his voice, trying to lure us back to the Pine Barrens, back to join its family. I know now why that old man at the diner looked so sad when he saw our children. He must have known. The Jersey Devil doesn't just hunt people, it changes them, makes them its own. And once it marks you, like it marked Lucy, it never lets go. I write this as a warning. If you're ever driving through New Jersey and see signs for the Pine Barrens, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't listen to the voices. And whatever you do, don't follow the lights in the woods, because somewhere in those ancient trees, the Jersey Devil is still waiting. And it's patient. So patient. Last night, I found Lucy standing by the window, staring at the moon. Her neck scales were glowing softly, just like Betty's feather used to. When she turned to look at me, half her face wasn't human anymore. "Don't be scared, Mommy," she whispered. "When the change is complete, I'll come back for you and Tommy and Betty. We'll all be together again. Even Daddy is waiting for us there." I hold my children close every night, but I know I'm running out of time. Lucy's transformation is almost complete, and the beating of wings outside our window gets louder every evening. The Jersey Devil isn't finished with the Blackwood family, not by a long shot. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if Harold is really gone, or if he's out there too, changed like Lucy, waiting in the Pine Barrens for his family to come home. This isn't the end of our story, it's just the beginning of a much darker one. My name is Marcus Walsh. I never thought I'd tell this story to anyone, but some things need to be shared even if they hurt to remember. It happened back in 1977 when I took my 2 boys camping in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Looking back, I should have listened to the warnings, should have turned that RV around the moment things started feeling wrong, but I didn't. I was different then. The Vietnam War had left me with nightmares that wouldn't go away, and after losing Sarah, my wife, my boy's mother, to cancer 3 years ago, I wasn't really the father I should have been. Derek was 17, already acting like a grown man, always looking after his younger brother Kyle, who had just turned 15 and was going through that angry teenage phase. I thought buying that old Coachman RV would fix things somehow. You know how it is. Fathers thinking a camping trip can solve all family problems. Derek pretended to be excited for my sake, but Kyle, he just rolled his eyes and kept those earphones glued to his head the whole time we were packing. "It'll be fun," I remember telling them that morning as we loaded up the RV, just like the trips we used to take with Mom. As soon as I said it, I knew it was the wrong thing to say. Kyle slammed the RV door so hard the whole vehicle shook, and Derek just gave me that look, the one that said, "Really, Dad?" I didn't know then that this wouldn't be just another failed attempt at family bonding. I didn't know that the Black Hills held secrets darker than my worst war memories, and I certainly didn't know that by the end of that trip, our family would never be the same again. Let me tell you what happened during those 3 days in the Black Hills. Maybe then you'll understand why I haven't spoken a word since that night, why I only write things down now, and why I still wake up screaming when I hear drums in the distance. The drive started out normal enough. Kyle was in the back of the RV with his music, while Derek sat up front with me, checking the map every now and then. The Black Hills looked beautiful that morning, all green and misty, but something felt off, even then. First it was the radio. It kept switching stations on its own, playing bits of static and old songs I'd never heard before. Derek noticed it too. "Dad, maybe we should get the radio checked," he said, frowning as he tried to tune it again. "Probably just the mountains interfering," I told him, but I wasn't so sure. Then the animals started acting strange. We saw a group of deer standing completely still by the roadside, all facing our RV, their eyes reflecting our headlights even though it was daytime. Kyle actually took his headphones off to look at them. "That's weird," he mumbled. The first words he'd spoken in hours. Around noon the RV started making noises it shouldn't. The engine coughed and sputtered, and white smoke started coming from under the hood. I pulled over near what looked like an old hiking trail. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by tall pine trees and hills that seemed to watch us. "Great," Kyle groaned. "Just great, Dad. Your brilliant idea is falling apart already." I was about to answer him when we heard footsteps crunching on gravel. A man in a ranger's uniform appeared from the trail. He was Native American, tall and serious-looking, with deep lines around his eyes. "You folks shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "This is sacred ground. The hungry ones don't like visitors." Derek stepped closer to Kyle, something he always did when he felt protective. "The hungry ones?" he asked. The ranger, his name tag read John Blackfoot, looked at each of us slowly. "There are things in these hills," he said. "Things older than the trees themselves. They've been sleeping for a long time, but lately," he shook his head. "You should leave before dark." I'd seen enough scary things in Vietnam to not be easily spooked, but something in his voice made my skin crawl. Before I could ask more, he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing as suddenly as he'd appeared. "Dad." Kyle's voice had lost its usual attitude. He sounded younger, almost scared. "Maybe we should try to find a garage or something." I tried starting the RV again. The engine turned over once, twice, then died completely. The sun was already starting to set, painting the hills in deep reds and purples. We were stuck, and somehow, I knew this was just the beginning of our troubles. The sun was setting fast, and we had no choice but to stay put for the night. I pulled out the emergency flashlights and started checking the RV's engine, but I couldn't figure out what was wrong. Derek helped me while Kyle stayed inside, finally looking worried instead of angry. "Dad," Derek whispered, glancing around. "Did you hear that?" I stopped what I was doing and listened. At first, there was just the normal evening sounds, wind in the trees, a few birds. Then I heard it. A soft thumping sound, like distant drums, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. We went back inside the RV and locked the doors. That's when Kyle called us to the window. "Look," he said, pointing to something in the growing darkness. About 50 feet from our RV, there was a deer carcass that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just lying there, it was arranged in a weird pattern, with its legs pointing in different directions. What made it scarier was that there was no blood around it, like it had been placed there. "Maybe it was a mountain lion," I said, trying to sound confident. "But mountain lions don't arrange their kills like that." Then Kyle started feeling sick. His forehead was burning up, even though it had been a cool day. Derek got him some water and our first aid kit, but nothing seemed to help. "It burns," Kyle kept saying. "Everything burns." As night fell completely, the drumming got louder. We could see shadows moving on the hillsides, like people dancing, but when we shined our flashlights there, nothing was there. Derek found something while looking for more medicine. It was a small wooden carving, shaped like a twisted human figure. None of us had brought it. It was just there, sitting on Kyle's pillow. "My watch is going backwards," Derek suddenly said, showing me his wrist. He was right. The hands were moving in the wrong direction. I checked my own watch, the same thing. Kyle's fever got worse. He started talking about being hungry, but refused the sandwiches we packed. He kept staring out the window, mumbling things none of us could understand. That's when we heard something heavy walking around outside the RV. It wasn't human footsteps. They were too heavy, too slow. Whatever it was circling our vehicle, getting closer with each round. We all huddled together in the back of the RV, trying to stay quiet. Kyle was shaking now, not from fear, but from something else. His eyes looked different in the flashlight beam. Almost yellow. "Dad," Derek whispered, holding his brother close. "What's happening to him?" I wish I knew the answer, but as the drumming got louder and Kyle's breathing became more ragged, I had a terrible feeling we were about to find out. None of us slept that night. Just before sunrise, we heard someone knocking on our RV door. My first thought was to ignore it, but then we heard an old man's voice. "You folks need to let me in," he called out. "Before they come back, I looked through the window first. There stood an elderly Native American man, probably in his 70s, holding a walking stick. His name was Tom Redhorse. He told us after we let him in. He took one look at Kyle, who was curled up in the corner sweating and shaking, and his face went dark. "Just as I feared," he said, sitting down heavily. "The Wendigo has chosen your boy." "The what?" Derek asked, still keeping close to Kyle. Tom pulled out some herbs from his pocket and started burning them. The smell filled the RV, and for a moment Kyle seemed to breathe easier. "The Wendigo," Tom explained, "is an ancient spirit of hunger. It takes over people, changes them. These hills are their hunting grounds. Have been for thousands of years." He looked straight at me. "Your boy found something out there, didn't he?" "Something old?" Derek pulled out the wooden carving we'd found. Tom's hands shook when he saw it. "This is a Wendigo trap," he said. "Our ancestors used these to catch their essence, but now it's caught your son's spirit instead." While we were talking, Kyle suddenly sat up. His eyes were fully yellow now, and when he opened his mouth, his teeth looked sharper. "I'm so hungry," he said, but his voice didn't sound like Kyle anymore. It was deeper, rougher. "There's still time," Tom said quickly. "But we need to act fast. The full transformation takes 3 days. This is just the beginning." That's when Derek found something else. Some old arrowheads under Kyle's pillow. When he touched them, he yanked his hand back with a cry. They were burning hot. "He's been collecting things," Tom said gravely. "The Wendigo makes them do that. Draws them to ancient objects." Outside, the drumming started again. Louder this time. Kyle's head snapped up like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. "Tonight will be worse," Tom warned. "Much worse. The others will come for him. They'll try to complete his change." "Others?" I asked, remembering the heavy footsteps from last night. Tom nodded. "Other Wendigos. They hunt in packs." He looked at Kyle with pity. "And they want your son to join them." Derek grabbed my arm. "Dad, we have to do something. We can't let them take Kyle." I looked at my youngest son, barely recognizing him anymore, and knew we were running out of time. The sun was already starting to set again, and somehow I knew that what we'd faced last night was nothing compared to what was coming. As the sun set on our second day, Tom helped us prepare. He drew strange symbols on the RV's windows with some kind of white powder, and placed burning herbs in each corner. Kyle was getting worse by the minute. His fingernails were turning black, and he couldn't speak anymore. He just made these awful growling sounds. "There's a ritual," Tom explained, his voice shaking. "But it's dangerous. Very dangerous. The spirits of the ancient burial ground might help us, but they demand a price." Before he could tell us more, Kyle suddenly stood up. His movements weren't human anymore. They were jerky and animal-like. He sniffed the air like a wild creature and looked at us with those yellow eyes. "Hungry." It was the last word he said that sounded like my son. Derek tried to reach for him. "Kyle, please, fight it." That's when the first attack came. Something huge slammed into the side of the RV, making it rock on its wheels. Through the windows we saw them, tall, skeletal creatures with antlers, moving in the darkness. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones, and their eyes glowed like Kyle's. "The pack is here," Tom whispered. "They've come for him." Kyle started screaming, "Tom," a sound that turned into a howl. His face was changing, stretching forward like a deer's skull. Derek grabbed him, trying to hold him back, but Kyle was too strong now. He threw Derek across the RV like he weighed nothing. "The burial ground," Tom shouted over the chaos. "We need to take him to the burial ground. It's the only way." Another crash rocked the RV. Through a crack in the window, one of the creatures reached in with a long, bony arm. Its claws missed Derek by inches. I grabbed my boy's baseball bat and swung at it, and the arm withdrew with a horrifying shriek. "Dad!" Derek yelled. "Kyle's getting out." My youngest son had somehow forced the RV's back door open. As he stumbled out into the darkness, his body was already changing more. His clothes were tearing as his limbs grew longer. His spine curved unnaturally. I had a choice to make. Stay in the relatively safe RV, or go after my son. But it wasn't really a choice at all. He was my boy, monster or not. Show me where the burial ground is, I told Tom, grabbing a flashlight. You'll need this too, he said, handing me a small pouch. Sacred tobacco. It might protect you, might not. Derek stood up, holding his bruised arm. I'm coming too. Outside, the pack of Wendigos was circling us, getting closer. Kyle was somewhere in the darkness, becoming one of them, and we were about to walk right into their hunting ground to save him. Tom led us through the dark woods, his walking stick tapping against rocks and roots. The drumming was everywhere now, and strange lights danced between the trees. Derek stayed close to me, both of us jumping at every sound. There, Tom pointed ahead. The burial ground is just past those stones. We could see Kyle's shape moving ahead of us. He wasn't my son anymore. He was almost fully transformed. His body was tall and thin like the other creatures, and small antlers were growing from his head. The sight made my heart break. Suddenly, the other Wendigos appeared all around us. They moved like shadows, their long limbs reaching for us. One of them knocked Tom down. I helped him up, but he was hurt. The ritual, he gasped, pressing the rest of the sacred tobacco into my hands. Make a circle with it. Call to the spirits. They'll know what to do. Derek grabbed my arm. Dad, look. Kyle was standing in the middle of the burial ground. His transformation was almost complete. The other Wendigos were gathering around him like they were welcoming him to their family. We have to hurry, I said, running toward Kyle. That's when everything went crazy. The ground started shaking, and blue lights rose from the earth like glowing mist. The ancient spirits Tom talked about were waking up. Derek ran ahead of me, trying to reach his brother. Kyle, please remember us. Kyle turned toward Derek's voice. For a moment I saw something human in those yellow eyes, like he recognized his brother. But then he lunged at Derek with his claws out. I started making the circle with the tobacco like Tom said, my hands shaking. The Wendigos were closing in, their horrible screams filling the air. Derek was on the ground, trying to crawl away from what used to be his brother. Dad, Derek shouted. The spirits, look. The blue lights were taking shape. They looked like Native American warriors, their forms transparent but clear. They moved toward the Wendigos, who backed away hissing. But Kyle wasn't backing away. He was fighting the spirits, and he was winning. I knew then what had to happen, and so did Derek. I'm sorry, Dad, Derek whispered. Then he did something I'll never forget. Derek ran straight into the circle, grabbing Kyle in a tight hug. I won't let you go, little brother, he said, holding on even as Kyle's claws dug into him. That moment of love, of human connection, made Kyle freeze. The warrior spirits surrounded them both, their blue light growing brighter and brighter. Complete the circle. Tom shouted from somewhere behind me. Do it now. With trembling hands, I finished the tobacco circle around my boys. The spirits started chanting, it a sound that made the whole world seem to vibrate. The other Wendigos tried to break through but couldn't cross the tobacco line. Kyle let out a horrible scream, part monster, part human. He was fighting it, I could tell. Derek wouldn't let go, even though he was bleeding badly. Come back, Kyle, Derek kept whispering. Come back to us. The spirit warriors raised their arms, and suddenly, Kyle's body started changing again. The antlers shrank away, his limbs returned to normal. But something was wrong. Both my boys were getting weaker. The price, Tom's words echoed in my head. The spirits demand a price. I ran to them, breaking through the spirit circle, but it was too late. Kyle was human again, but Derek wasn't breathing. No, I begged, holding both my sons. Please, not both of them. Kyle opened his eyes, his normal human eyes. They were filled with tears. Dad, he whispered. What happened? Where's Then he saw Derek, and his face crumpled. The spirit warriors began to fade. The Wendigos had disappeared. It was just me, holding my boys in the early morning light. Kyle was alive, but Derek had given his life to save his brother. Tom limped over to us. "Your eldest son," he said softly. "He chose to be the sacrifice. The spirits couldn't save both of them. They needed a pure soul to trade for one that was marked." That was the last time I spoke. The horror of that night, losing Derek, seeing what almost happened to Kyle, it took my voice away. Some things are too painful for words. Kyle recovered, but he's never been the same. Neither of us have. Sometimes, when we visit Derek's grave in the Black Hills, we can hear distant drums, and sometimes in the corner of my eye, I see blue lights, like spirits standing guard. They say the Wendigos still hunt in those hills, but they never came near us again. Derek's sacrifice made sure of that. He saved more than just his brother that night. He saved us all. That was 15 years ago. I still live near the Black Hills, in a small house with Kyle. He's 30 now, works as a park ranger, trying to keep others away from those dangerous places. He never talks about that night, but I know he thinks about Derek every day. The scar marks from the Wendigo's claws never fully healed. They turn dark and burn whenever we get too close to those sacred grounds. Sometimes, on quiet nights, we sit on our porch and watch the hills. Kyle swears he sometimes sees a blue light moving between the trees, like Derek's spirit is still watching over us. I want to believe that's true. Last week, something strange happened. A family in a new RV pulled up near our house, asking for directions to the same camping spot where we had broken down all those years ago. Their younger son had the same hungry look in his eyes that Kyle had back then. Without saying a word, I still can't speak, I frantically waved them away. Kyle came out and firmly told them to try the state park instead. After they left, Kyle turned to me and said, "We can't save everyone, Dad, but we can try to warn them." He was right. That's why I'm writing this story now. Not just to remember Derek's sacrifice, but to warn others. The hungry ones are still out there, still waiting. The drums still beat in those ancient hills, and sometimes, on cold nights, we can hear howls in the distance, not quite animal, not quite human. If you're ever driving through the Black Hills and see those sacred grounds, keep driving. Don't stop, no matter what. Some prices are too high to pay, and some sacrifices too great to bear. I know this, because I paid that price. I lost one son to save another, and my voice to keep the story. But at least now you know. At least now you can choose to stay away. As for me and Kyle, we'll keep our watch here, protecting others from the fate that found us that terrible night in 1977. It's what Derek would have wanted. My name is Lucia Martinez, and I never thought our family summer vacation would turn into a fight for survival. I still remember that hot July morning when Mom shook Diego and me awake at 5 a.m., excitement sparkling in her eyes. "Kids, pack your bags. Your Tio Alberto left us something amazing in his will," she said, waving an old envelope. I groaned and looked at my twin brother Diego, who was already falling back asleep. We'd never even met Uncle Alberto. He was Dad's mysterious uncle who lived somewhere in Arizona. The only thing we knew about him was that he spent his whole life searching for something called the Lost Dutchman's Mine. 3 days later, we stood in a dusty parking lot, staring at our inheritance, a huge orange and brown Winnebago RV from the 1970s. It smelled like old leather and pine air fresheners, but Mom and Dad acted like it was made of gold. "It's perfect for our treasure hunting adventure," Dad said, running his hand along the scratched metal. "Alberto's letter says the mine is hidden somewhere in these mountains." I looked up at the Superstition Mountains looming ahead of us. Their jagged peaks reminded me of monster teeth against the bright blue sky. Something about them made my skin tingle like right before a thunderstorm. We were loading our supplies when this super old man appeared out of nowhere. His white beard reached his chest and his skin was dark and wrinkled like dried leather. "Turn back," he whispered, gripping Dad's arm. "The Canyon Keeper doesn't like treasure hunters. It's taken many before you." Diego rolled his eyes. He never believes in stuff like this. But I felt cold all over, even in the Arizona heat. That night, while everyone was sleeping in the RV, I found these weird cave drawings on some rocks. They showed a giant human-like figure standing over tiny people. The scariest part? The giant seemed to be wearing something that looked exactly like Uncle Alberto's old amulet, the one Mom was now wearing around her neck. I should have known right then that we were in big trouble. But that was just the beginning of our nightmare in the Superstition Mountains. The weird stuff started on our third day in the mountains. I woke up early and found Mom looking confused at our map. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "We've been driving for hours, but we keep ending up in the same canyon. It's like the mountain is playing tricks on us." Diego thought our GPS was broken, but I knew it was something else. Every morning the tall red rocks around us looked exactly the same, with one twisted tree that seemed to point at our RV like a bony finger. That afternoon, while collecting firewood, I found something that made my heart stop. There in the dirt was a footprint, but not just any footprint. It was huge, bigger than Dad's whole body, and in the middle was something sparkling, real gold dust. "Diego, come look at this," I called out. But by the time he got there, the footprint was gone. Just gone. Like it had never existed. Only a few specks of gold dust remained on my fingers. That night, I had my first vision. I was washing dishes when suddenly everything went dark, and I saw flashes of images, a giant shadow moving through the canyon, people running scared, and Uncle Alberto's face trying to tell me something. When I snapped out of it, the plate I was holding was broken, and Mom was shaking me. "Lucia, honey, are you okay?" I wanted to tell her about what I saw, but how do you tell your mom you're seeing things that aren't there? Later that evening, Diego came running into the RV, holding an old leather book. His hands were shaking with excitement. "Look what I found in that cave near the creek," he said, carefully opening the crusty pages. "It's some kind of journal written in Spanish. And look at the date, 1848. Mom, who teaches Spanish at our high school, started reading it. Her face got paler with each page. "It's from a Spanish explorer," she whispered. "He writes about a guardian of these canyons, a creature that protects something much more valuable than gold." Just then we heard a sound that made us all freeze. From somewhere in the dark outside came a deep rumbling noise, like a mix between thunder and a growl. Dad grabbed his flashlight, but Mom stopped him from going outside. That night, none of us slept well. The RV kept creaking in the wind, and I could swear I heard footsteps, giant footsteps, circling our campsite. Diego finally admitted. He was scared too, which never happens. The next morning we found giant claw marks on the ground around our RV. Dad said they were probably from a bear, but bears don't leave marks that glow slightly in the dark. The morning after we found those glowing claw marks, things got even stranger. I was staring at them, trying to make sense of it all, when a huge shadow passed over us. At first I thought it was a cloud, but when I looked up I saw it marked bigger than any plane I'd ever seen, with wings that blocked out the sun. "Thunderbird," I whispered, remembering the stories Uncle Alberto used to send us in his letters. We weren't the only ones who saw it. A beat-up truck came roaring into our canyon, carrying 3 rough-looking men with lots of hiking gear. Their leader, a tall guy with a nasty scar on his face, started asking us questions about what we'd seen. "We've been tracking that thing for weeks," he said, but something about the way he looked at Mom's amulet made me nervous. "Say, that's a nice necklace you got there, ma'am." Mom grabbed the amulet tightly and backed away. That's when she finally told us the truth about Uncle Alberto's research. She'd been translating his old papers every night while we slept. Alberto wasn't just looking for gold, she explained once the men left. He found out about an ancient guardian that protects these canyons. The amulet is connected to it somehow. She showed us Uncle's journal, full of drawings of a giant creature that could change its shape. Sometimes it looked human, sometimes like a monster, and sometimes like that huge bird we saw. "But that's crazy, right?" Diego laughed nervously. "Giant shape-shifting monsters aren't real." Just then Dad, who'd gone to check out a nearby cave, didn't come back for dinner, or after dinner, or by midnight. "Something's wrong," Mom said, grabbing her flashlight. "He never stays out this late." We were about to go look for him when we heard those men's voices outside our RV. They didn't sound friendly anymore. And they weren't alone, there were more of them now. "Give us the amulet," Scarface called out, "and nobody gets hurt." Diego and I looked at each other. The same thought hit us both. Dad's disappearance, these men, the Guardian, it was all connected. And somehow we were right in the middle of it. Then we heard Dad's voice, calling for help from somewhere in the darkness. But it sounded different, like it wasn't quite him. Mom clutched the amulet so hard her knuckles turned white. "Kids," she whispered, "I think it's time you knew what your Uncle Alberto was really protecting all these years." Mom's hands shook as she quickly told us everything. "The Guardian isn't just protecting gold, it's protecting a gateway, a door to somewhere else. Your Uncle Alberto became its helper, but when he got too old," her voice cracked, "he needed someone to take his place." Suddenly, the RV started shaking. Outside, the treasure hunters were shouting and firing their guns at something huge. I peeked through the window and gasped. The Guardian was there, a giant figure that kept changing, one moment looking like a person, the next like a mountain made of shadows. "Run!" someone screamed. I watched in horror as golden light poured from the ground, wrapping around two of the treasure hunters like bright ropes. They disappeared into the earth, their screams echoing through the canyon. That's when we saw Dad, the real Dad, stumbling out of a cave. "The portal," he coughed. "It's opening." We ran to him, but the ground started cracking beneath our feet. Golden light spilled from the cracks like lava. Diego's eyes got a weird glazed look, and he started walking toward it like he was in a trance. "The gold," he whispered. "Can't you hear it calling?" I felt it too, this weird pull, like the gold was singing to us. Mom grabbed Diego's arm, but he pushed her away. I'd never seen my twin brother look so different. "Diego, no," I screamed. But he kept walking. Dad suddenly ran forward. "I understand now," he said, looking at Mom. "What Alberto did, what has to be done." He hugged us quickly. "I love you all." Before we could stop him, Dad ran toward the widening crack in the earth. He held up his hands and started speaking words I didn't understand. The Guardian turned toward him, and for a moment they seemed to look at each other with recognition. "Close it," Dad yelled. "Use the amulet, Isabella, now." Mom pressed the amulet to her heart and began to whisper. Light exploded everywhere. I grabbed Diego, finally snapping him out of his trance. But as the light faded, we saw Dad and the Guardian merge into one being. The last thing I remember was Mom pulling us toward their RV, tears streaming down her face. Diego broke free and ran back, shouting something about helping Dad. There was another flash of light, and when it cleared, Diego was gone too. But somehow, I could still feel him. Not gone exactly, but changed. Now when I look at these mountains, I know my brother and father are here, watching, protecting. Mom and I still live in Arizona. Sometimes on quiet nights, we drive up to that canyon. And if you look carefully when the sun sets, you might see two shadows moving across the peaks. A big one and a smaller one, keeping watch over the gateway that nobody else will ever find. People ask us what happened to Dad and Diego. We just smile and say they found what they were looking for in the Superstition Mountains. And in a way, that's the truth. Because some treasures aren't made of gold, and some guardians are closer to home than you'd think. My name is Pierre Robichaud, and I've spent my whole life in these Louisiana swamps. 47 years of watching the waters rise and fall, listening to the whispers of the cypress trees, and learning the secrets that most folks would rather forget. But what happened during that 3-day tour in the Atchafalaya swamp still haunts me, keeping me awake on moonlit nights. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was standing outside my old tour office, a weathered wooden building that's been in my family for generations. The morning sun was trying its best to break through the thick fog, making everything look like an old faded photograph. My converted school bus RV, which I'd painted swamp green and lovingly called Old Bessie, was all ready for another tour. That's when they showed up, 5 tourists who had no idea they were walking into something bigger than just a swamp adventure. There was Sarah, clutching her expensive camera like it was her baby. James and Maria, newlyweds who couldn't keep their hands off each other. Dr. Weber, who kept adjusting his glasses and looking at everything like it was something to study. And Linda, scribbling in her little notebook, probably cooking up another one of her mystery stories. "Welcome to Robichaud Swamp Tours," I said, trying to sound cheerful despite the weird feeling in my gut. Something about the way the air felt that morning, heavy and electric, like right before a big storm, should have warned me. But I ignored it, just like I ignored the way my grandmother's old silver cross felt unusually warm against my chest. I was about to lead these 5 strangers into my swamp, not knowing that by the end of 3 days, most of them wouldn't be human anymore. And me? Well, I was about to learn that some family traditions are written in blood, not water. But let me start at the beginning, with our visit to Mama Celestine's shop. Because that's where the real trouble started, even though none of us knew it then. Mama Celestine's shop sat at the edge of town, looking more like a garden shed than a voodoo shop. Old wind chimes made from bones and shells clicked softly in the morning breeze as we walked up the creaky wooden steps. I noticed Sarah taking pictures while Dr. Weber mumbled something about local superstitions. "Y'all wait here," I said, holding my hand up at the doorway. "Mama Celestine doesn't like too many visitors at once." I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of herbs and candle smoke filled my nose. The shop was dark except for a few candles, their light making shadows dance on the walls covered with dried plants and strange bottles. "I've been expecting you, Pierre," came Mama Celestine's voice from the back. She was sitting in her old rocking chair, her white hair wrapped in a colorful scarf. Her eyes, though clouded with age, seemed to see right through me. "Just another tour, Mama," I said, but my voice shook a little. She shook her head slowly. "Not this time, child. The swamp is restless. The rougarou are stirring." She grabbed my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "The blood moon comes tonight. You remember what your grandmother told you about blood moons?" My throat went dry. Grandmother's stories about the rougarou, the werewolf-like creatures from our legends, came flooding back. Stories I'd tried to forget. "Take this." She pressed a small leather pouch into my hand. "And remember the old words when the time comes." She started humming an ancient French prayer, one I hadn't heard since I was a kid. Back outside, the tourists were getting restless. Linda was the first to notice something was wrong. "Everything okay, Pierre? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just getting some local advice," I said, trying to sound normal. But when I looked back at the shop, Mama Celestine was at the window, making the sign of the cross. That's when I heard it. A low howl in the distance, even though it was broad daylight. The tourists thought it was just a wolf or a dog, but I knew better. In all my years in the swamp, I'd never heard a normal animal make a sound like that. "We should get moving," I said quickly, heading toward Old Bessie. Lot of swamp to cover before dark. As we drove away, I checked my rearview mirror. Mama Celestine was still watching, and for the first time in my life I saw fear in her eyes. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the leather pouch heavy in my pocket, wondering if I should just cancel the whole tour. But it was too late. The swamp was calling, and somehow I knew we had to answer. Old Bessie rumbled down the dirt road as we headed deeper into the swamp. The sun was high now, but under the thick trees, it felt like evening already. Spanish moss hung from the branches like gray curtains, swaying in the hot breeze. "Look at those birds," Sarah called out, pointing her camera at some herons. But something was off. The birds were flying away from the swamp, not toward it. In all my years as a guide, I'd never seen that before. Weber was busy writing in his notebook. "Fascinating ecosystem," he mumbled. Though I must say that voodoo shop visit was rather theatrical, I kept quiet, feeling Mama Celestine's pouch against my leg. The air was getting thicker, and not just from the heat, it felt like the swamp itself was holding its breath. "Pierre," Maria called from the back of the RV, "what's that smell?" I sniffed the air. Something wasn't right. There was a strange musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting leaves. James wrinkled his nose, and Linda stopped writing in her notebook. Probably just swamp gas, I lied, but my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. We reached our first stop, a small clearing where I usually let tourists take pictures. As everyone filed out of Old Bessie, I noticed the silence, no birds singing, no insects buzzing. Just the sound of water dripping from the trees. "Let's keep close together," I said, trying to sound casual, but I kept one hand near the hunting knife on my belt. Linda wandered a few steps away, looking at some strange marks on a tree. They looked like claw marks, but way too big for any normal animal. "Pierre," she called. "What made these?" Before I could answer, we heard a splash in the nearby water, not the normal splash of a gator or fish. This was bigger, and whatever made it was moving fast. "Everyone back in the RV," I said quietly, but firmly, now. They must have heard the fear in my voice because nobody argued. As I started the engine, I caught movement in my side mirror. Just a shadow, but it was too tall to be human, too quick to be natural. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky blood red through the trees. Mama Celestine's warning echoed in my head. The blood moon comes tonight. I had to get these people somewhere safe before dark. But as Old Bessie crawled through the deepening shadows, I realized something terrible. In the Atchafalaya swamp, there might not be anywhere safe left to hide. I found a small clearing as darkness crept in, just big enough for Old Bessie to park. The moon was rising, huge and red, casting strange shadows through the trees. My hands shook a little as I set up the camping lights around the RV. "Everyone stay inside, while I check the area," I said, but Linda was already heading toward the bathroom we'd set up behind some trees. "I'll be right back," she called over her shoulder. I wanted to stop her, but James was asking about dinner plans, and Dr. Weber was complaining about the mosquitoes. That's when I heard it. Linda's scream, not a scared scream, but something worse. It cut off suddenly, like someone had pressed a mute button. "Linda," Sarah yelled, jumping up. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the bathroom area, the others right behind me. The beam of light showed empty trees, Linda's notebook on the ground, pages fluttering in the wind, but no Linda. "Spread out," Dr. Weber said, taking charge. "She can't have gone far." "No," I said sharply. "Nobody spreads out. Something's wrong here." I picked up Linda's notebook. The last page had strange scratches on it, like claw marks through the paper. Then we heard the singing, soft and eerie, floating through the trees. It was an old French prayer, the same one Mama Celestine had hummed earlier. But this voice wasn't human. It was too rough, too wild. Maria grabbed James's arm. "What's that?" she whispered, pointing to the water. The surface was starting to bubble, like a pot about to boil. Steam rose up, glowing red in the moonlight. The radio in Old Bessie suddenly crackled to life, even though I hadn't turned it on. Through the static, we heard more voices chanting in ancient French. Sarah started recording it on her phone, but the battery died instantly. "Look." James pointed at the trees. Hanging from the branches were little dolls made of twigs and moss. They hadn't been there minutes ago. I was sure of it. "Everyone back in the RV," I ordered, my voice shaking. "Now." As we hurried back, I saw something move in the shadows. It walked on two legs, but it wasn't human. Its eyes glowed yellow in the darkness, and when it growled, I saw teeth that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. We locked ourselves in Old Bessie, but I knew the locks wouldn't help much. Not against what was out there. I pulled out Mama Celestine's pouch with trembling fingers, knowing that whatever was happening, this was just the beginning. The night was only getting started, and somewhere in the darkness, Linda was still missing. None of us slept that night. We huddled in Old Bessie, jumping at every sound from the swamp. James kept holding Maria's hand, while Dr. Weber wrote frantically in his notebook, trying to make sense of everything. Sarah sat by the window, her camera ready, though her hands were shaking. Around midnight, James started acting strange. First it was just sweating, which wasn't unusual in the swamp heat. But then his hands began to shake, and his eyes looked different, almost yellow in the dim light. "I don't feel so good," he mumbled, scratching at his arms. Maria touched his forehead and pulled back quickly. "He's burning up," she gasped. "Pierre, we need to get him to a doctor." I was about to answer when we heard it. Howling. But not from just one creature. It sounded like a whole pack, and they were getting closer. The sound made my skin crawl because it wasn't quite wolf, wasn't quite human. It was something in between. "Those aren't wolves," Dr. Weber whispered, his scientific certainty crumbling. "What are they?" I pulled out my grandmother's old diary from under the driver's seat. I'd never shown it to anyone before, but now I had no choice. "They're rougarou," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My family, we've known about them for generations. They're like werewolves, but different. They hunt in packs, and they can turn others into their kind." James let out a painful groan, and we all turned to look at him. His fingernails were getting longer, darker. Maria started crying, but she didn't let go of his hand. "There's got to be a way to help him," Sarah said, her camera forgotten now. That's when we heard scratching on the roof of old Bessie. Something was up there, walking around. Through the windows we could see more shadows moving in the trees. Yellow eyes watched us from the darkness. "Pierre," Maria pleaded, "do something." I opened Mama Celestine's pouch with shaking hands. Inside was a small bone charm, and a piece of paper with words written in French. As I read them, the scratching got louder, and James's groaning turned into something that didn't sound human anymore. We were trapped in old Bessie, with one of our own changing into something else, while outside, the pack of rougarou was closing in, and somewhere out there, Linda was either dead, or becoming one of them. The night was only half over, and I had a terrible feeling that by sunrise, none of us would be the same. As the night went on, things got worse. James's transformation was happening faster now. His face was changing, getting longer, more wolf-like. Maria wouldn't leave his side, even though he kept telling her to stay back. Weber had stopped writing, and just stared, his scientific mind unable to explain what he was seeing. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, showing us her camera screen. She'd managed to take a picture through the window. In it, I could see them clearly for the first time. The rougarou, they were tall, wolf-like creatures standing on two legs, with glowing yellow eyes. But what scared me most was seeing Linda among them. She wasn't fully changed yet, but her face was different, wilder. Suddenly, James let out a howl that made us all jump. His clothes were tearing as his body changed. Maria screamed as he pushed her away, his hands now looking more like claws. The diary. I remembered flipping through my grandmother's pages. "There's something here about a cure." I stopped as I read the words. "It needs to happen before the third night of the blood moon, or the change becomes permanent." That's when Dr. Weber grabbed his throat, coughing. "I think it's happening to me too," he gasped. His glasses fell off as he doubled over in pain. The scratching on old Bessie's roof got louder. Through the windows, we could see more rougarou gathering. They weren't attacking, they were waiting for James and Dr. Weber to complete their change. "Pierre," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "What's that?" Through the trees we saw a light moving toward us. As it got closer, I recognized the figure holding it. Mama Celestine, walking through the swamp like the monsters weren't even there. The rougarou moved aside as she approached. She rapped on the door 3 times with her walking stick. "Let me in, child," she called. "There ain't much time left." I looked at the others. James was almost fully changed. Dr. Weber was starting to transform, and Maria was crying silently. Sarah just nodded, holding her camera like a shield. With trembling hands, I reached for the door handle. Outside, dozens of yellow eyes watched and waited. Whatever happened next would change everything. As soon as I opened the door, Mama Celestine hurried inside. She looked at James and Dr. Weber, shaking her head sadly. "It's worse than I feared," she said, her voice low and serious. "The pack is growing stronger. James growled, his eyes now completely yellow. Dr. Weber was curled up in the corner, his skin starting to sprout fur. "Can you help them?" Maria asked, her voice shaking. Mama Celestine pulled out a small bag from her pocket. "There's a way, but it's dangerous. We need to perform a ritual, and we don't have much time." Suddenly, the RV rocked violently. The Rougarou outside were getting impatient. "What do we need to do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to go outside," Mama Celestine said. Sarah gasped. "Out there, with those things?" Mama Celestine nodded grimly. "The ritual must be done under the blood moon. It's our only chance to save your friends, and stop the pack." I looked at the others. Maria was holding on to James, even though he barely looked human now. Dr. Weber had stopped moving, but we could hear his bones cracking as they changed shape. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do it." As we stepped out of Old Bessie, the Rougarou surrounded us. I could see Linda among them, her eyes wild and hungry. Mama Celestine started chanting in Old French, drawing a circle in the dirt with her walking stick. "Whatever happens," she said to us, "don't leave the circle." The Rougarou growled and paced around us. James let out a howl that didn't sound human at all. Dr. Weber stumbled out of the RV, his clothes in tatters, his body changing fast. Mama Celestine's chanting grew louder. The blood moon above us seemed to pulse with an eerie light. I held my breath, hoping against hope that this would work. But then, everything went wrong at once. The Rougarou attacked all at once. They lunged at our circle, but something, maybe Mama Celestine's magic, maybe something older, kept them back. It was like an invisible wall surrounded us. "The ritual isn't working fast enough," Mama Celestine shouted over the howls. "Pierre, your family's blood, you're connected to them. You must lead the ritual." Before I could ask what she meant, James broke free from Maria's grip. His transformation was complete. He wasn't James anymore, but a full Rougarou. He jumped at Maria, but I pulled her back just in time. "Pierre," Mama Celestine pressed her walking stick into my hands. "Remember the words your grandmother taught you, the old words." Suddenly, memories flooded back. Summer evenings on the porch, Grandma teaching me prayers I didn't understand. But now, looking at the chaos around us, the words came back. I started chanting, my voice shaking at first, then growing stronger. The Rougarou stopped attacking. They tilted their heads, listening. Even James and Dr. Weber stopped moving. That's when Mama Celestine did something I'll never forget. She stepped outside the circle. "No," I yelled, but she raised her hand to stop me. "The ritual needs a sacrifice," she said calmly. "A willing one." The pack surrounded her. Linda, or what used to be Linda, moved closer, sniffing the air. Mama Celestine stood straight and proud, still chanting. Sarah was recording everything on her phone, her hands shaking. Maria buried her face in my shoulder, unable to watch. The moon turned darker red, and Mama Celestine's chanting reached a fever pitch. Then, in a flash of red light, she vanished. The Rougarou howled, not in triumph, but in pain. James and Dr. Weber fell to the ground, their bodies shaking. The other Rougarou backed away, whimpering. Linda collapsed too, but something was happening to me. I felt strange, powerful. My sight sharpened, my hearing intensified. I could smell. Everything in the swamp could feel the pulse of every living thing around us. I realized what Mama Celestine had done. She hadn't just saved the others, she'd awakened something in me. Something that had been sleeping in my blood for generations. As the red light faded, I felt different, strong. The Rougarou weren't scary anymore. They were waiting for me. Somehow I'd become their new leader, their alpha. James, Dr. Weber, and Linda slowly changed back to human form, confused and weak but alive. They wouldn't turn into Rougarou again. Mama Celestine's sacrifice had cured them. Maria ran to James, crying and hugging him. But the original pack of Rougarou stayed. They needed someone to guide them, to keep them from hurting people. That someone was me now. "Pierre," Sarah's shaky voice brought me back. "Are you okay?" I nodded, feeling the power running through my veins. I understand now, I said softly. My family didn't just know about the Rougarou, we were meant to lead them, protect them, keep them in check. The sun was starting to rise, painting the swamp in golden light. The Rougarou melted back into the shadows, but I could feel them waiting. They were my responsibility now. You all need to leave, I told the others. Get in old Bessie, Sarah will drive you back. What about you? Maria asked, holding on to James. I have to stay, I said. The swamp needs a guardian. The Rougarou need a leader. Sarah handed me her camera. I deleted everything, she said. Some stories shouldn't be told. They climbed into old Bessie for the last time. As they drove away, I watched until the RV disappeared around the bend. Then I turned to my new pack, feeling the change come over me naturally now. Old Bessie sits empty in that clearing to this day. Some say they hear strange howls at night, but nobody gets hurt anymore. The swamp keeps its secrets, and I keep watch over both worlds, human and Rougarou, and sometimes, on quiet nights, when the moon is full and red, I think I hear Mama Celestine's voice in the wind, reminding me that some family traditions are meant to be kept forever. That's my story. True as the swamp is deep, every single word, so if you're ever in the Atchafalaya, and you hear howling in the distance, don't be afraid. We're watching over you. Just don't stay after dark. Some things are better left to the shadows.